Thank you very much. That's when I had brown hair. I was older. Still have hair. And the most relevant piece of that really sweet introduction was, of course, the last bit, that this is my third time addressing this group, and I'm flattered, I'm delighted. I certainly have, I know many colleagues that have come, including Amy Jaffe yesterday, who I've known for probably 20 years, and she's great. So it's nice to be on the stage with that, and also with such a nice group. I have to tell you, I do remember addressing you guys before, and I didn't think there were so many of you. So I don't know what's been happening with this conference. Let me start, because they gave me a couple of these. They told me you had the interactive devices. I said, well, I'll take 3 minutes and get you guys engaged. So let's throw a couple of questions up here, and you tell me what you think. So let's start. I'm going to talk globally. I think everybody here knows that. I'm going to go around all the hot spots. Many of them are harder than I'd like to be, but this is not all going to be doom and gloom, I promise you. But to start off, let's be upbeat. So if we're looking outside the United States, for growth and expansion, the best long-term bet is Brazil, China, India, and Russia. I just go alphabetical order, so you don't see any internal preference for me. If you could just punch them in, and we'll see where we go. And we get India. Look at that. And look how different that is from where it would have been 12 months ago, 24 months ago. India has, of course, great demographics. It's got a very strong population, but it finally has leadership. And it's finally starting to build infrastructure. Where China comes in number 2, world's second largest economy, going to be the largest. Brazil number 3, and only 4% of you think that Russia is the best long-term bet. I should almost ask for a show of hands on Russia, but I'm not going to make you do that, because you could have inputted incorrectly. You never know. So let's go to number 2. Next question. For growth and expansion, the worst long-term bet. And not exactly the opposite of the best, right? I want to know, where's the place that you absolutely refuse to put cash? Brazil, China, India, or Russia? Let's go, please. And we get Brazil at 23%, Russia at 67%. Sanctions, poor demographics, opacity, difficult leadership. China only 9%. Very few people think that China is the worst long-term bet, despite the fact that it is clearly the most volatile in terms of its impact on the global economy and agenda. That's interesting. I think over time, you're likely to see that China 9% go up. I'm not surprised by the other responses here. We go back in 2 years again. Who knows? If you invite me, we'll do it. Let's go to the next question, please. The next president's biggest foreign policy opportunity. I'm not presuming I know who this person's going to be, but their biggest foreign policy opportunity will come from, number 1, transatlantic trade. Number 2, the opening of Cuba. Number 3, the opening of Iran. And number 4, a breakthrough partnership with China. What do you think? I could have put 10 things here, but 4 is what we have the space for. So let's go with these 4, please. And the answer is a breakthrough partnership with China, 40%. 26% of you said the opening of Iran is going to be the biggest foreign policy opportunity of the next president. Given how controversial that Iran deal has been, that is interesting from this group. I'm with you on all of these. I think Cuba's interesting, and it certainly will matter, but it's hard to say it's going to be the largest. And transatlantic trade, in my view, is probably not going to move forward. Next. The next president's biggest foreign policy challenge will come from, number 1, Russian aggression. Number 2, China's expansion. Number 3, Iran's revival. And number 4, ISIS. Please. I love that there's different music for each of these. That's nice. ISIS 45%. Russian aggression, 29. Iran's revival, 18. China's expansion, 8. I think that the concern of China's expansion is underestimated significantly here. It does not surprise me that ISIS is getting the numbers it is. It is 9/11, and we are seeing the headlines, of course, specifically with the refugee crisis and the rest. I'll talk about that. Okay, we can clear the screen. I guess I should start by talking about 9/11. It's been a good while. I live pretty close by, and you see the site near completion. There's no question that the war on terror is not the top priority of the United States in terms of foreign policy these days. It's not where the Americans are spending effort. It's not where they're spending most of their money. It's also true that we are 14 years after 9/11, seeing the world's most powerful, best funded, and largest terrorist organization, not in the last 14 years, but in history. That's what ISIS presently represents. And that disjuncture is something that I think we'll see a lot in the geopolitical environment going forward. The idea that the world is becoming much more unstable, but it's not clear exactly how much we should be paying attention to that. Think about it. We have more refugees right now globally than at any point since World War II, and those numbers are increasing by records every day. And we are having a very serious debate on immigration in the United States right now, having nothing to do with the refugee crisis whatsoever. We're talking about building a wall in Mexico, maybe Canada. It's fair, you know. I think with Canada, more of a hedgerow would be nice. This is pretty. Scott Walker promises he didn't really mean that when he said it's okay. But we're not talking, in fact, only Martin O'Malley has really brought up the Syria refugee issue in talking about immigration, and he is barely a candidate, right? I think he's officially polling 0 right now. So what's interesting is that you have 4 million refugees from Syria alone. You have failed states in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen. 24% of the Lebanese population today are refugees. 24%. In Jordan, you've got well over 1 million. Turkey, you have 2 million refugees. It's absolutely destabilizing the economy of these countries. It's absolutely undermining the political system. And while it's been growing for the last 4 years, as the Syrian war in particular has gotten worse, the headlines have only started really paying attention to it in the last few weeks. The reason for that, of course, is because 95% of all of these refugees of the 4 million from Syria are in Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. 5% in Europe. Now that they're coming into Europe, we're starting to pay more attention. It's interesting because ISIS is a massive threat in the Middle East region, and it's becoming a much more significant threat in Europe. How much of a threat is it to the United States? Much harder to say. You can build walls with Mexico, but of course the real immigration issue with the United States, the fact that we have oceans, it is so hard to swim to the United States from Syria. It is really long. And so the fact that Obama said we're prepared to accept 10,000 in 2016 out of those 4 million may have some symbolic resonance for some, but of course is irrelevant to the actual issue. This leads me to a broader point before I start really talking about global politics and the economy. which is that the United States, in my view, is not in decline. You don't see that with unemployment numbers today. You certainly don't see it with the growth and the profitability of U.S. multinationals across the board. The United States, we all know, is now the leading energy producer globally. It is absolutely the leading innovator in technology in so many of the key technology spaces. We're the largest food producer in the world. Our demographics are reasonably positive, and we're geopolitically very stable and insulated from all of this stuff. So you can't look at the United States and say, oh my God, we're in decline. In fact, if you're Chinese and you're worth $1 million or more, you want your kids in American universities, you want your money in the U.S., you want to buy apartments and houses, you want U.S. treasuries, very clear. The Chinese are not investing in sending their kids to be a part of a country in decline. But U.S. foreign policy influence is in decline. Globalization and Americanization have been largely the same thing over the course of the past decades. Increasingly, as I stand in front of you today, I will tell you that is not true anymore. We should not predict that in the next 10 years, the United States as dollar, as global reserve currency, will have the same resonance that it has today. We should not predict that the U.S.-led global worldwide internet will continue to be the basic standard by which people get online. They won't. It's going to fragment. And I guess I should say that not because there's any other country out there that's going to supplant the U.S. No one else wants to be the global superpower. The United States said that they'd accept 10,000 refugees. You know how many Chinese? The Chinese have said that they want to accept how many Syrian refugees? I could have put that on the screen. 0. 0. And they have provided humanitarian aid so far since 2012. $14 million has been provided by the Chinese to help the Syrian refugees. That's about 0.1% of the total amount that's been given by the world. Interesting for the world's soon-to-be largest economy, right? So it's not as if you're going to see global leadership supplanted from the United States to China. And if it's not China, it's obviously not anybody else, because no one else is close in terms of size, military capability, wherewithal, you name it. But what I do think is that there is only one country of size out there today that has a global economic strategy. And it's not the United States. It is China. And that should unnerve you. The notion that the Chinese government is spending well over $1 trillion on things like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Silk Road Overland and Maritime Initiatives, the Chinese Development Bank, all oriented to build infrastructure and make capital investments across Asia and in other countries across the world, not because they're humanitarians, but because they expect a quid pro quo. It is the Chinese Marshall Plan. It's what we did after World War II. But when we did the Marshall Plan, we wanted these countries, we're going to invest a lot of money in Europe, and in return, we want them to become more democratic, them to become more oriented towards the free market, them to engage in more free trade with the United States and with the global order that we had created. The Chinese are not doing that. They are investing over $1 trillion to ensure that there is a challenge to a U.S.-led global standard. Not a Chinese global standard, just a Chinese standard that individual countries can choose from. That they'll want more people to denominate in Chinese RMB. That's going to happen. They're going to want more people to use the Chinese internet. Largest internet market in the world today is China. Facebook, Google, not participating. Apple, our largest company by market cap. If we think about the move to the Internet of Things, if we think about the Apple Cloud, and the fact that the way that they show that they're important is in part that they control data and so you can't hack into them. that is antithetical to the Chinese model over the medium term. I doubt Apple will have an effective business model in China when they become the world's largest economy within 10 years. But that's our largest company. What does that mean? It means we're going to see more fragmentation of what had been a US-led global market. That is not the decline of the United States, but it is the decline of US foreign policy influence. That is important for those of us that are investing in a global economy. There's no question. So that's a bit of a setup of how I think we should be thinking about the world today, that the US is going to be stable, the US is going to be safe, a lot of people will see it as a safe haven, and yet our ability to drive outcomes in other parts of the world that aligns both adversaries and allies with what we want them to do, that is eroding very quickly. So let me now go to a few places around the world and talk about what I think is going on. And I'll even try to do a little US elections at the end, but I want to make sure I give you guys real coverage. Some Asia, some Middle East, some Europe, some Latin America, that kind of thing. And since I've talked a bit about China, let me start in Asia. One of the biggest things that's happened in the last month has been that the Chinese market, the stock market, has suddenly taken a radical nosedive. We've seen huge volatility. In fact, we saw the chief global economist of Citi yesterday say that they believe that there is a significant chance that the world goes into global recession because of China. Now, I don't happen to believe that. I think it's extremely unlikely. But I do think that we underestimate just how important the change is. That suddenly, the soon-to-be largest economy in the world is one that is controlled by the government, it is state capitalist, it is maximally opaque, it has no interest in political openness or free market competition between Chinese actors and Western actors. They absolutely want to do business with us, but on radically different terms than you would expect in a free market economy. And the impact of that opacity and that volatility on the global markets is going to be much greater. The single biggest takeaway you can have from that will affect all of you is that the quality of global growth today and in 2016 is significantly lower than it was 3, 5, 10 years ago. And the reason for that is because global growth is more reliant on a massive driver of the global economy that you have much less confidence in. It's not that China's real economy is about to implode. It isn't. In fact, the Chinese stock market really isn't connected to the Chinese real economy. It's very small. It's not an open market. There's a lot of state intervention. And believe it or not, the average Chinese retail investor in the Chinese stock market is only there for a matter of weeks. You want to talk about short-term investing. This is not like the United States and Europe. So the fact that there was this doubling of the Chinese stock market a year ago, most of the people that are participating in the market today that are taking the huge hits from 2 months ago are different people. It's a casino. And the Chinese government is not willing to allow political dissent from all of these Chinese retail investors that took this big hit. So the immediate reaction of Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, when the markets went down, is we're going to intervene. And when that intervention proved a little bit awkward, it didn't work very well, he gets criticized. So even though the Chinese market is not related to the real economy, even though there is no chance that the wheels are going to fall off of Chinese growth in 2016, it's going to slow. It's not going to fall off. What's interesting is that Xi Jinping, who had been the single most successful global leader of any major economy in the last 2-3 years, suddenly his honeymoon is over. He's under domestic pressure. He can no longer drive the reform agenda and the transformation of the Chinese economy the way he used to. That's actually good news for you in the short term, because it means that he has to back away from the move to squeeze Chinese state-owned enterprises, and he's got to do stimulus. So by the end of this year, you're going to see a lot of additional Chinese government money pumped into the economy. That means higher commodities demand. That means prices are going to go up. It's going to help the Brazilians, help the Indonesians, help the Australians. It's going to help your industry a bit, because we've all been concerned about softness of Chinese demand. The bad news, this is not sustainable long term. Long term, the Chinese government knows they have to make these changes. So either they will be successful, and so they'll go back to the old reforms that we have been seeing, the strong anti-corruption and the continued move to make more efficient the state enterprises, or they will fail. They'll continually pumping money in, and within 3 to 5 years, you will see a real bubble. And then we're going to get hit. So it's just a question of when you want to take your pain. But for now, we're going to see an easing of the reform process that you've had in China, and the demand for commodities is going to go up. And you'll experience this pretty quickly. So that's interesting. One more point on China. As you probably know, Xi Jinping is on his way to the United States in a couple weeks. And that's not going to be an easy meeting. There's been significant Chinese military buildup in Southeast Asia. The United States has itself sent more military. They've been skirmishing a fair amount. The Chinese have engaged in cyber attacks of breathtaking and unprecedented scope against the United States, including everyone pretty much in the U.S. that has a clearance. They've grabbed all that information. The Office of Personnel Management, you may have seen it, over 20 million accounts that were hacked by the Chinese. The Americans have said in response that we are going to put sanctions against American companies right before Xi Jinping comes to the United States. In other words, he's going to lose face. We're not just going to be wilting flowers. That all sounds great, right? Except that the Chinese response was, we're going to host a technology summit in the United States before we meet with Obama, and all of the American firms that want to participate in China are going to be a part of this, or else they'll suffer the consequence. Microsoft immediately said, we'll co-host, and all the American firms sign up. The United States may feel like they've got a problem with China. The American companies want no part of this fight because they are super invested in China. China knows how to use their control of the Chinese economy to jujitsu their challenges with the American market. So that means you're probably right. Only 9% of you thought that we were going to experience a big challenge going forward with China. But part of the reason for this is because the United States will not be able to effectively counter the increasing challenges to the U.S.-led global standards, precisely because American corporations will say, well, no, we want to kind of play with China too. We won't be able to coordinate. That will weaken the U.S. dollar. It will weaken the U.S. position in setting accounting standards, financial standards, what have you. Over the long term, that's a serious hit to U.S. productivity and efficiency. So 5 to 10 year trajectory here is going to be really challenging. Some good news before I complete Asia and go someplace else. I'm completely with you on India. And I wasn't a year ago. And neither were you. Right? I mean, as Xi Jinping's facing his domestic challenges, Modi is not. I was in India a couple months ago. And, after a week there, I was asking everyone, what are the biggest challenges we see right now? And I heard things like, well, Modi's traveling too much, so he's not able to really follow through on a lot of what he's talking about. And this one minister, Arun Jaitley, who is, they've streamlined the ministerships, so there aren't as many of them. And that means there are a few people that are in charge of a lot of things. And he's minister of commerce and telecom and 4 other things. And he's very capable, but they say he's working so hard that he looks sick. And then they talk about the fact that some of the conservative ministers have been saying some things about, Hindu women need to have more children because otherwise the Muslims will outpopulate India, and that, Modi needs to hit back hard. I'm telling you these things. You're probably saying, wow, that's all kind of interesting, but who cares, right? But I was there for a week. Those were the biggest criticisms I heard. I must have spoken to 250, 300 people, right? So and a lot of these, some of them were journalists and some of them were cab drivers. I'm no Tom Friedman, but still, I'll talk to a cab driver. Take that as you will. But it's the mustache. So I can't grow the mustache. But I also spoke with ministers and I spoke with CEOs. If I had done that same trip 2 years before, the criticism would have been, oh my God, why would anyone invest here? You can't get anyone to return your phone call. There's corruption everywhere. The government is horrible. The bureaucrats are incompetent. No, they've really changed their mind. People think this government reflects a desire to transform India into a real economy that understands business. And that doesn't mean the bureaucracy has no corruption. It doesn't mean it's going to turn around overnight. But certainly in all of those states in India where you have new chief ministers that are part of Modi's party, BJP party, you're seeing a dramatic movement to open the markets and be responsive to foreign direct investment and build infrastructure fast. Combined with the fact that the average age in India is 25. So Modi won big because you had 180 million people in India that could vote for the first time. And they feel differently about business. They feel differently about caste. They feel differently about what they want from their government or gender relations. And that's exciting. Going to India, you can feel that energy in some of these cities, especially those that are more industrialized on the Western corridor. So I am a believer that the India market is going to start growing big. You're going to see gaudy numbers from a lot of these provinces, double-digit growth, and you'll see it for a decade or more. They're way behind China. But this is really a good story because long-term, India is a pretty stable place where long-term China might make it or the system might collapse, and we don't know. So the uncertainty factor for India is actually much lower, even though it's going to take you a lot longer to make good money there. That's really positive. Final big point on India, last one I promise, is that when you look at the big potential challenges, Japan versus China, they hate each other, right? Are we going to see a fight? Actually, both of these countries understand that they need economic benefits from the other. And they are trying hard not to play the nationalist card. In fact, I am told that we're going to hear an announcement pretty soon on a date for the first ever summit between Abe in Japan, Xi Jinping in China, and President Park in South Korea, which the Chinese are organizing. The Americans tried to do this 18 months ago. We failed. The timing wasn't right. It's going to happen. And that is great for Japan, and it's great for peace in Asia. So long term, there's going to be all of this geopolitical transformation, big defense spending across Asia. Certainly long term, India's rise will be seen as a threat to China. But for the next few years, I actually think the headlines will not be driven by big geopolitical tensions in Asia. The big exception is Hong Kong and Taiwan, but the United States has largely given up on them. So you'll see demonstrations, you'll probably see some people killed. Hong Kong and Taiwan will be less attractive places to invest, but it will not have spillover. The big concerns that we might have, that we had 2 years ago when I was speaking with you, everyone was worried about Japan, China. Japanese investment into China went down 45% year on year after the last time I talked to you. We're not going to have that problem in the next 2 years. That's pretty positive. So anyway, I spend most of my time on Asia because it is the largest part of the global economy. It is the most dynamic in terms of growth, leaving aside Africa. Now I'm going to move. So Amy talked to you about the Middle East a fair bit yesterday? Yes, okay. Or maybe not, I don't know. I think she did. Let me start with Iran. Show of hands, you have to pick one of two. The Iran deal was a good deal or a bad deal? If you have to choose, show of hands. How many of you thought the Iran deal was a good deal? Show of hands. How many thought the Iran deal was a bad deal? Show of hands. About 90% of you thought it was a bad deal. I'll tell you, I didn't think it was a great deal. I would have voted for it. But I also think it was mischaracterized. The way that the media portrayed it was that either you sign the deal or it's war. Actually, it was either you sign the deal or you maintain the interim deal and you keep negotiating. That's not war. It's kind of boring, but it's not war, right? Now, it is true that the deal that we were ultimately going to be able to sign with the Iranians was probably not going to be much better than the deal we actually got. But I do think specifically on the relaxation of the arms embargo, which the Russians threw in the last minute because they knew we were gagging for a deal, and on this 24-day period before the Iranians have to give you access when you do inspections, and they can't hide enrichment because there will be radioactive traces, but they can hide military research, which they're not allowed to do and which no one's talking about. On those two issues, I think we should have pushed harder. But Kerry desperately wanted it. The Europeans were on board. The Russians and Chinese certainly didn't care. And Obama was like, even if we get that, we might not get it, and does it really make the deal that much better? So, I mean, I can kind of see it either way on this front. It's obvious that the big impact of the Iran deal, the biggest impact of the Iran deal is sanctions are gone. The Iranians get a boatload of cash, about $80 billion total. They say $100 billion, but some of it's already, sort of tied up with old contracts. So $80 billion real cash, which they can do stuff with. Like support Hezbollah, like support Assad, most importantly, fight ISIS on the ground in Iraq, and they are aligned with the U.S. on that front. We should remember that. But also it means that we're going to see another 1 million barrels a day of Iranian production within 12 to 18 months, and that's not going to stop. Now, it is true that the Iranian deal is not going to be implemented well. I mean, if you ask me, do I think the Iranians will cheat on this deal? Of course they will cheat on this deal. I mean, I'm sure we would cheat on the deal if we were in their position, especially because they can get away with it. What's going to happen is they're going to refuse access to military sites. We're going to demand it. There's going to be a question of whether or not they refused and how they refused. And the Russians are going to take the Iranian side. And the Russians are part of the P5+1 process, the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council plus the Germans. They were the ones that negotiated this whole thing. And the Europeans will not want the deal. They will want the Iranians, they don't want them to develop nukes. They'll want the Iranians to comply, but they also will be in there fast doing business, right? I mean, the French are already saying, allons-y, right? They want to sign deals fast, while the Americans are still going to have congressional sanctions on. So the fact of the matter is that even when the Iranians cheat, the Americans are going to be very hard-pressed to go it alone and tear up the deal. So Iran is going to open. We are going to see energy open up there. We are going to see a lot of investment, and Iran is going to become an important geopolitical player in the region. I think this is on balance good news for the United States long term, even though it's bad for your industry, because on balance, lower energy prices in a U.S. diversified economy are positive. You get more growth. On balance, it's also good because if you want Iran to open up and this government to fall apart, you're much more likely to accomplish that with foreign direct investment into Iran over the long term than you are with continued sanctions. I also am a firm believer that the Americans were not going to be able to maintain the sanctions regime given where the Europeans are. They want growth. They're sick of listening to the U.S. on this front, and the Russians and the Chinese that actively want to subvert the U.S. So this is my U.S. is not in decline, but U.S. foreign policy is. It means you better take the Iran deal because your leverage in 5 years' time is going away. The biggest question is how the geopolitics of the region are changing, and here I want to talk very briefly about Syria, because Syria is not very relevant to the Iran deal directly, but the reason why the Russians are suddenly sending all this military material into Syria is because the Iran deal is now done. They didn't want to scuttle the deal. They didn't want to bring the geopolitics into the fore because that would suddenly see that the Russians and the Iranians were supporting Assad. Now that the deal is done, the Russians and the Iranians are supporting Assad. The Americans are saying Assad must go. Are you kidding me? He's going nowhere. In fact, he's going to have real support on the ground, while our primary focus is to fight ISIS. You can't beat ISIS from the air. Assad doesn't want to spend too much resources doing it himself because he's trying to maintain his own stability, and so ISIS isn't going anywhere. What does this mean? It means more refugees, more fighting, more threat of failed states in the Middle East. Jordan is the one you want to pay most attention to, could be next to really emerge into civil war. Unfortunate but true. More refugees in the region, more refugees heading to Turkey and Europe. Very negative for Europe. Final point. What does all this mean for oil prices? If the geopolitics of the Middle East get worse, aren't oil prices going to spike again? Actually, I don't think so, because the Saudis are all by themselves. Despite the fact that the Saudis are really unnerved by the Iranians getting more powerful, if you look at the Gulf Cooperation Council, all of the other allies of the Saudis, they're all saying, we want to do business with everybody. I mean, Qatar's like, well, we can work with Saudi Arabia, and we can work with Iran. The United Arab Emirates has been helping the U.S. in terms of tracking potential terrorist supporters, but Dubai also has 40,000 Iranian shell companies and a lot of money going through, and they can't wait for sanctions to be over. Oman, same story. The Saudis basically have Bahrain, which is a part of Saudi Arabia for all intents and purposes, and Kuwait, and that's it. So if you ask me, the Saudis are the losers here. They will continue to produce because they're not interested in eroding market share. And it doesn't really matter what happens in Syria on that front. So the prospect of a bigger Saudi-Iran fight does not give you relief on oil prices, doesn't bring them back up. So for me, it's not just the baseline scenario, it's the scenario. The geopolitics on energy are not going to get significantly worse for the next 1 to 2 years. I don't see anything big that's going to make that happen. The relief scenario is because the Chinese are doing stimulus. That's where you see it. That's what I'd be focused on. So that's a little bit of the Middle East. Very easy to go from the Middle East up to Europe and Eurasia. I am so happy I don't need to talk about Greece. I was so sick of talking about Greece. You got to admit, though, that the deal that is being floated by the German government and by Brussels on these refugees looks a lot like the German deal on Greece. It's too small, it's too late, it doesn't fix anything, it's usually acrimonious, but it shows a little bit of leadership. Same thing. They're going to accept resettlement of 160,000 migrants/refugees when millions are going to be coming in. They're going to have to pay too much for it, and they get no real support, and they don't strengthen European institutions. Europe is eroding. The Brits are not a part of this deal. Populism is growing. Hungary is barely a democracy. Prime Minister Viktor Orban is much closer to Putin than he is to any of the major European leaders, and his view is, I'm done with Russian sanctions, and I don't want any of these refugees, and by the way, pay me for all of that. Europe is really in an environment where it's harder for local governments to lead, it's harder to come up with any policies that would support efficiency and growth, and meanwhile, the geopolitical environment around Europe, because of the refugee issue, the growing terrorist issue, the Russian threat on Ukraine and the Baltics, they're all growing. The thing that worries me most, we all saw months ago France's 9/11, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. 8% of France's population is Muslim, and the French do not integrate these Muslim, largely young men into their economy or their political system. Unemployment is over 50% in that population. They live in slums. They're not considered French by many French nationals, despite the fact that most have citizenship. So the Germans can allow all of these migrants in. They can give them housing. They can give them food. They will do it efficiently. They can give them a path to asylum. And we can applaud that because their lives will be radically better than they are sitting in refugee camps without education or capabilities in Jordan or Egypt or Lebanon or Iraq. But they will not be integrated into German society. And God forbid we see the Charlie Hebdo attack that occurs in Germany.
Because the one thing we've all been able to count on over the last 2 years, 4 years, even since the 2008 financial crisis, we've been able to count on German leadership in the persona of Chancellor Angela Merkel. And she is now putting herself out there saying, we must accept 800,000 refugees a year, and we're going to pay for them. There's a lot of domestic opposition to that in Germany. That opposition will prove toxic if we see violence and terrorism, which is likely. I'm not happy about this. I'm not saying they shouldn't accept these people. As someone who sees the Statue of Liberty out my window frequently, I'm not someone who thinks the United States should only be talking about 10,000. It doesn't really matter. What matters is what the implications are for the markets, not whether or not you like the responses. And what we're going to see in Europe is that this refugee crisis is much more damaging for Europe's growth and its integration and coherence than anything you saw around Greece, than anything you've seen around the Eurozone crisis. This is much worse. So I do really worry about where Europe is heading, your ability to want to invest significantly in Europe, your ability to believe on the European consumer, to believe on efficiency, and particularly to believe in the European common market. That is going away. I don't think Ukraine's going to get much worse because I think the Europeans are going to end sanctions against Russia. And the Russians know it. So actually, we won't talk as much about that crisis, just the Ukrainian government will get stuck. They won't have a Europe or a NATO option. They'll be forced to accept that their country is permanently divided. And the Europeans will start doing business with Russia again. The 4% of you that thought that Russia was the most attractive market to engage in the BRICS over the long term, I think you're probably wrong. But that's okay. You guys probably do too. It would have been sad if it was 0%, right? I mean, you don't want anything to be 0%. That implies I shouldn't have asked the question. I do believe that Putin is going nowhere. He's got 85% approval. His demographic challenge, the population had been shrinking. The average Russian is making a lot more money today than they were making 20 years ago, and that was all through Putin. They can take the hit. And boy, they're mad at the U.S., and boy, they're mad at the U.S.-led international system, and that also benefits Putin. So the U.S.-Russia relationship will be horrifyingly bad. U.S. sanctions will stay pretty strong all the way through. We won't be able to do big business there, but the Europeans will go back in, and the Russian economy won't be in recession in 2016 the way it is in 2015, even if oil prices are low. So that's a little bit of that. Before I go to questions, and I know we have 6 roving mics, and I've got some time for that, and after questions, by the way, well, we've got a half-an-hour break, and I'm not going to go anywhere, so please come up and say hi and ask me other stuff. But let me at least cover a little Latin America and a word on the U.S. elections. It's not that I don't care about Africa, but if you only give me an hour, you're going to have to ask questions about it. I can't cover everything in an hour. I just can't do it. Latin America. So Brazil is not growing. Brazil, the popularity for Dilma Rousseff, the president, is in the low teens right now. Those are record lows. You've got hundreds of thousands of people that are demonstrating for her impeachment. The opposition party supporting that too. I don't think she's going to be impeached. But she clearly can't get any policy through, which is a real problem because they desperately need to get their fiscal house in order. They desperately need to have better reforms for social stability over the longer term, for improved infrastructure, for things like basic policing in slums and lower class areas, certainly improved transport, mass transit, that kind of thing. That's not happening. So the Brazilian people are angry. The only good news I can give you about Brazil is that this massive scandal, this car wash scandal as they call it, which is bringing down not just the leadership of Petrobras, but also most of Brazil's infrastructure, construction, engineering, and strategic sector companies, is desperately overdue. It's like you go to Illinois and you basically say, we're going to clean up the entire government. And so as a consequence, everyone goes. That's what's happening in Brazil. It's all of the old leaders from Brazil's Workers' Party, the PT Party. This is going to hit Lula. That's good. Because Brazil has needed to have efficiency and transparency in their strategic sector for decades, and they haven't dealt with it because it grew like Topsy. Well, now it's not growing, and now they actually have an independent investigating process that is overturning every stone, and they have plenty of money because the American SEC is helping them. So the next 2-3 years, you go to Brazil, and all you're going to talk about is this scandal and Dilma Rousseff. But the next president of Brazil is probably going to be more pro-market as a consequence, and the next president of Brazil will look like a hero because all of this will have been dealt with. So if you're willing to stomach the long-term pain, Brazil's trajectory in 5 and 10 years' time, for me, looks pretty good. In fact, I opened an office there last year for precisely this reason. So I mean, Eurasia Group did. I didn't, but I can say I did. Everyone should have a Brazil office. Whenever you go there, you kind of do feel that way. I think, otherwise, Venezuela clearly not going anywhere. I know oil's crushing the economy, but the Chinese are willing to continue to provide them just enough cash so they don't actually crack. So Maduro's under no pressure right now. I think that's something we don't focus on for a while. Mexico looks good to me, but we got to recognize they just had midterm elections, and just like in our midterm election, no one turns out and votes. So Peña Nieto thinks he wins, when in reality he has seething discontent and populism among lower and middle classes. If the Mexican economy turns around and a lot of the very smart reforms that are being placed in Mexico actually start working in trickle down, then that's fine for the upcoming Mexican elections. If it doesn't work, then you could have the same thing in the U.S., in Mexico, that you're starting to see in the U.S., which is populism becomes a big problem in the Mexican presidential election. Because López Obrador and his new Morena party performed really well. And you need to cut that off if you want Mexico to be a place that you're happy with long term. That's a real fat tail risk in Mexico. We got to watch that as we get closer to 2018. Final point, U.S. How many of you would vote for Trump? Show of hands. One guy. There he is. Everyone go and attack him. Right in the middle. Nobody. Who are these people? I ask occasionally. Nobody raises their hand, but they're there. They're there. Right? I do think, if you had asked me, was the summer of Trump going to be replaced by the autumn of Trump, I would have said, no, it's going to be replaced by the fall of Trump. For me, that was what was more likely. But he does have more staying power. There's no question. It is interesting that the anti-establishment sentiment in American politics has become nearly as large as it is in Europe. But the role of vested interests and cash in the U.S. presidential process is vastly greater than Europe. And so that means right now you've got 17 candidates, and the money's not lined up behind any one person, and it's not really being spent yet. That's going to change. I have a hard time believing that Trump maintains 30% as people just get bored and tired and move on. I don't think he can be as new and shiny an object for another 6 months. But I also think that when you end up with 1 or 2 establishment candidates that start actually spending money and big corporate interests get behind them, and Lord knows they aren't going to want Trump because he's not going to be taking their money, that will destroy him. So I think he'll have influence, and he has influence on the issues. I think the likelihood he gets the Republican nomination is functionally zero. And don't invite me back if it turns out that I'm wrong on that. The Hillary question is an interesting question. I heard that Amy said that she thought Hillary wasn't going to be the nominee. I was surprised to hear her say that. I don't believe that. But I will tell you, a friend of mine who is very high up in the White House told me 2 weeks ago that if he had done what Hillary had done, he would be in jail. And I was surprised to hear that from him. And I think that is the issue. That is the frustration, is that no one is going to beat Hillary for the actual nomination, but for the Democratic Party, but the possibility that what she did around this email process continues to spiral and an indictment comes, I think that's a real risk. I don't know if it's 1 in 10 or if it's 1 in 8 or it's 1 in 4, but it's a real risk. And they're going to stall it and drag it out as long as humanly possible, and they have the ability to do that. But there's no question that top secret emails on a private server are the kind of things that have brought down a lot lesser people in the process. And I think that it's not going to go away. That doesn't stop Hillary from becoming the president, giving electoral math if she gets the nomination. But it is going to stick with her no matter what through this process, and we'll watch where the legal issue goes. So, I mean, if you're really interested in who the president's going to be because of the implications for trade and foreign policy and jobs, employment, healthcare, you name it, those would be the kinds of things I would watch. I don't have a view on who the Republican nominee is going to be yet. It is way too early, and I don't think I'm any more credible than anyone else at this point. So, but I think I am on a lot of this global stuff, so I spent my time on that. So we have 10 minutes for questions, and I hope that was interesting and enough and not too fast, because I've been away for 4 weeks, and this is as tan as I get. And the world has changed. August was supposed to be quiet. It wasn't quiet. It really annoyed me. It never is. It never is. So if we could now have a little bit of light, we could see who has questions. There was one starting here, and as I find you, we will bring them over to you. And if you see questions, please, microphone people, just bring them over in. Please, we'll start with you, sir.
Dr. Bremmer, really appreciate your presentation. I want to tie in your presentation with what General Pace had said yesterday, and that's in regard to cyber warfare. Okay, he said similar to nuclear warfare, right now the big powers balance each other out, because I can do the same thing to you, you can do the same thing to me. What he was concerned was the lower echelon of intelligence who controls the computer situation. And we said that the biggest threat we all thought was ISIS. And the reason I'm asking the question is ISIS, the mentality of ISIS, I don't compare them with the mentality what Russia has or what China has. So what is your take on the danger of cyber warfare when it trickles down to a much lower echelon?
That's right, and that echelon is not just ISIS, that echelon is anonymous. That echelon is WikiLeaks. I mean, you know, in my mind, much more disruptive potentially is when you have 14 million email accounts of Ashley Madison that are the contents of which are made public, than when you have the Chinese stealing all of this information on American classifications. And the reason I'm less worried about the Chinese is because we have that information on China. Are you kidding me? I mean, we've been doing all of this on cyber and espionage against Chinese intelligence and Russian intelligence for 20 years, and we're better at it than they are. We just don't talk about it very much, right? But we do it, and the only issue we have is that we really don't like parity. We don't want tit for tat. We don't want the Chinese to have the same capability we do. That does create mutually assured cyber destruction. We just would rather have a big lead. I mean, think of, we didn't like it when the Soviets tested their first nuclear weapon. We're like, no, we'd like to monopolize these. Not likely to be the case, but that's what we wanted, right? So I absolutely worry about this. And I think that ultimately, while the Chinese will continue to rip us off in terms of industrial espionage using cyber to grab secrets, proprietary information, and data, they're not trying to destroy companies. They're not trying to make information public so that systems collapse, because they're very integrated with the American system. They need the American system to continue to succeed so they can make money off of it. That's actually important to them. That is not important to ISIS. That is not important to WikiLeaks. It's not important to Anonymous. And there's no defense against that. And the level of proliferation and diffusion of destructive cyber technologies to actors that cannot be deterred is exponential. So if you were to, I mean, we've got 500 clients at Eurasia Group, and I talk to lots of CEOs in the US and around the world, and the number of them that talk to me about climate and sustainability and how much they spend on that compared to cyber is astonishing to me. Like, it should be the other way around by a big margin. It's not because I don't care about climate, but climate is happening over decades. It's incremental. It's going to hurt the disenfranchised people first, so we aren't going to deal with it. It's a massive collective action problem, so even if we spend money, it's going to be ineffective for a long time. And the efficiency of the technologies to deal with climate are getting radically cheaper over time, so what we end up doing will be dramatically different than what we would do if we spent that money today. So it's putting bad money before good, all right? And I say this as someone who is desperately concerned about the climate condition, but just understands it's not going to get fixed, and so we should bet that way. Where on cyber, it hurts the establishment folks first. There are no adequate defenses. It's exponential and much shorter term, and it's transformative. So I really think I'd be spending 10 times more on dealing with cyber than I was focusing on climate, and I'd be doing as a major multinational corporation. And I'd certainly be putting much more effort in terms of understanding how to take advantage of it as well as how to avoid the problems. Because companies are going to go down on the basis of this stuff. All right, so I'm really glad you asked. I didn't talk about it because I was talking about the geopolitical space, and I knew that Pace was here yesterday talking about cyber, so I didn't want to necessarily step on his territory, but you can ask me questions about whatever you want, right? I'll just go there. So who's next?
Way in the back.
Yep.
What changes do you think we should make to the immigration policy, especially regarding the southern border?
I wouldn't be nearly as focused on that issue as we are, in part because I'm sure you know Mexicans are not coming over the border in the numbers that they have been in past years. As the last 2 years, actually, Mexicans are no longer the largest immigrant group year on year in the U.S. First it's China, then it's India, and then it's Mexico. Those numbers will keep going down as Mexico becomes more of a developed economy, and also as labor becomes more important in the United States system. I mean, it's true that Mexico and then, of course, China, eventually their labor undermine the United States, the great sucking sound globalization. But our technology will destroy their labor. It will also destroy our labor, but it'll destroy their labor first. So I'm less concerned about the long-term magnetic pull of the United States for low-cost labor in the United States. And I think that the refugee issue is largely, it's much more of a dire situation for Europe than it is for America. Do I think we need a wall along the entirety of the U.S. southern border? Of course I don't. I think sanctuary cities are stupid. Because they allow basically the creation of collective action problems when the United States needs to have federal laws that are actually upheld. And I feel that way. I feel the same way about same-sex marriage and clerks needing to uphold it as I do migration policy and San Francisco needing to uphold it. It's a basic national principle that undermines the sanctity and the strength of the United States. But do I think that we need to have a better system to actually be able to track repeat offenders and to go after them? Of course we do. It is not a larger percentage of the American territory in terms of migrants coming over than it is Americans that are born here. Let's also keep in mind France. The big problems the French have are not the immigrants that are coming in first generation that are happy to be there and desperately want to work. The big problem the French have are the ones that have been born there, the first, the second generation, that are citizens that are saying, we hate this country, they're doing nothing for me, as a French person. And that's where they're getting violence. So I think the Americans actually, our biggest Muslim problem in the U.S. are African Americans in jails who are repeat offenders that are getting radicalized by local imams. They have no connection to the Middle East whatsoever, but they're building potential radicalized cells that over time will create terrorism. So for me, it's not, I don't think the immigration issue is, it's certainly, if I were Trump, it's very salient. Why not talk about it? You're going to get people to vote for you. But those are politicians. I'm a political scientist, so I get to not talk about that. I get at least one or two more questions.
Hi.
Yep.
Good morning.
Hi.
I was wondering about something you didn't mention. How much impact do you think that the Panama Canal expansion, when completed in the next 18 months, 2 years, is going to have on the economy, especially the U.S. economy?
I think it'll be significant, absolutely. You probably already know that now the longest direct flight in the world, which used to be Newark to Singapore, I took it all the time, they stopped doing it, didn't make economic sense, because apparently I didn't travel on it enough. It's now Dubai, Panama City. Sort of the investments are there. The economy, the Panamanian economy, of course, is on fire. And the ability to take these super tankers through is going to make the United States and Latin America more easy, more attractive. But of course, I also think you're just getting much more efficiency as well and the bigger game changer is the fact that you're not going to have Arctic sea ice. And so as a consequence, you have much cheaper, 1/3 cheaper shipping as a consequence that can go northern route. The Nicaragua canal, by the way, is not going to happen. Those of you that have heard these massive plans about a sort of huge multi-billion-dollar deal that's going to be funded by the Chinese in Nicaragua, the individual who is connected to a state-owned enterprise in China that's been promoting that deal the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has actually published a document that has said that he is not supported by the Chinese government. The Chinese government does not actually support or recommend the project. I suspect his life is in danger. He's done something very stupid. He's probably pocketing a lot of cash. That deal's not happening. So again, because of that, Panama is not going to have competition. Panama is going to get a lot of attraction there. I think it helps the U.S. Sure I do. Last question? Yep, in the back.
What is your view of Israel's role in this new geopolitical structure in the Middle East?
So, look, Israel is now geopolitically in a stronger position than it used to be. I mean, I know that Obama and Netanyahu have bad relations, and the United States does not care as much about Israel as it used to, and that's clearly evidenced by the movement on the Iran deal, which Netanyahu so strongly opposed. But Israel now does have friends in the region. President Sisi in Egypt is a strong supporter of the Israeli government, has been coordinating with the Israelis in dealing with Gaza, dealing with the Sinai, dealing with Hamas, and really cutting them off, which has undermined the Palestinian position. The Saudis have absolutely stepped up their, sort of behind-the-scenes contacts with the Israelis, because the Saudis see that Iran is their major problem, not Israel. I mean, it used to be 5 years, 10 years ago, you'd go to the Middle East and people would be saying, oh, you've got to fix Israel-Palestine or nothing else gets fixed. People still care about Israel-Palestine, but they really care about Syria. They really care about Assad. They care about ISIS. They care about Iran. I mean, Israel-Palestine has become like issue number 10 for most of the Middle East with influence. And so that means that Israel can kind of do what they want internally. And we saw with the war on Gaza that you had about 2,500 Gaza, mostly civilians, killed in that war a year ago, and the impact on the Israeli government in the Middle East was negligible. Furthermore, you didn't see the Europeans supporting sanctions, though there were some. The Netherlands government talked about it, and the Netherlands pension system stripped out the ability to invest in Israel. There was a little bit, there's some demonstrations. But the average European is not looking for things to further hurt their economy right now. So there isn't much grassroots support to say, we've got to stand up for the Palestinians. So the Palestinians have gotten frustrated. They just had a vote in the United Nations. They're flying their flag in front of the General Assembly during the 70th anniversary meetings. That's nice symbolically, but it doesn't get them anywhere. And the Israelis continue to build their settlements. So I think that Israel is quite stable from a security perspective. The real question in Israel's domestic politics, Netanyahu right now has only a one-seat majority with his coalition in the Knesset, and he's going to lose it. And by the way, they're getting hurt particularly because of this massive gas find in Egypt, which means that they no longer, with their own gas find, are going to have export markets. So Netanyahu's really getting hurt on the domestic economic side. He won his election barely because he was able to raise the specter of Iran. That's just not going to play over the medium term for him. So you will see a new leader emerge in Israel in relatively short order. But Israel is used to really fragmented governments that come and go. It's not going to change the way you think about them in the region very much. So that's that. And with that, I'll turn it back to you guys.